joining us this morning. So let's give folks a few minutes to join us. As someone who attends a number of webinars, I have some experience of arriving a little late. So I want to give folks an opportunity to join us. And so a lot of folks joining us this morning from all over the country. Thank you again for being with us this morning. Again, my name is Emiliano Diaz de Leon. I am the Men's Engagement Specialist. On the screen, you'll see my contact information, so feel free to make a note of that. And I want to encourage you to contact me if you have any questions or comments or even feedback about today's webinar. Shoot me an email, give me a phone call, send me a message, tweet at me. And I want to encourage all of you during today's webinar to please share across social media platforms using the hashtag Engaging Men. And so if you're not familiar with that hashtag, I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's pretty common across most social media platforms. But if you take a look at that hashtag, you'll see just sort of a collection of sort of relevant information, resources, research, training, articles of interest, etc. Under that hashtag around Engaging Men. And so I want to encourage you to share as much about your own personal insights from today's webinar. And please tag us on social media. And yeah, tag us on social media at TAASA or at EC Diaz de Leon. And that way you can definitely follow us as well. I want to encourage you to do that so that if you have any question in the future, you can reach out to me there. As well as feel free to send a direct message of you if I can be of any assistance or if you have any questions. Give me a minute. I am going to close something. I apologize. All right, sorry about that. All right, so why don't we get started? I think it's give folks a few more minutes to get here and get you situated. I do want to provide you with a little bit of guidance on go-to training. So if you're not familiar with that, I wanted to share that with you. So just so you get a sense of the navigation tools, you're familiar with them and are able to use them during today's webinar. I just want to review them really quickly and encourage you to utilize them as much or as little as you'd like. There is a little arrow where you can open and close your control panel. So all you have on your screen is the slides. There's an option, a little hand that you can raise. I believe so, yeah. You can raise your hand. If you have a question or if you need any assistance, technical assistance during today's webinar, feel free to raise your hand. In addition to that, you will be able to listen and talk. Primarily listen. Unfortunately, I'm not going to open up any of our lines, so you'll be listening to me for the next hour and a half. But definitely make sure that your audio is working, that you're able to hear, and I highly recommend using headphones. And we want to make sure that you're able to hear everything that we cover in today's webinar. And then, most importantly, want to encourage you to use the chat feature. And speak to me directly or to the entire audience. And so there's a chat function at the right-hand corner of that bar. So feel free to send messages and share your insights and your questions and your comments there. Langston's asking if there are slides available. Yeah, I'll definitely be happy to make those available to folks if they're interested in them. If you've never been to one of my webinars before, there's not a lot of content in my slides, so that you might not find that useful. But if you are interested in getting a PowerPoint, a PDF of the slides, feel free to email me and I will get those to you. So thank you, Langston, for that question. So yeah, I am very happy to be joined by a couple of my colleagues in the room, and they are in the chat room and are ready to assist you with any questions or comments or any technical assistance that you need. I want to thank Maya Pilgrim, who is our evaluation manager. Maya just introduced herself a little bit in the chat box, so feel free to say hi to Maya if you have any questions or any concerns or need any assistance with technology. Maya will be able to hopefully help you with those. And then in addition to that, our other team member that's here with us is Dukes, who is our primary prevention specialist. So Dukes, please say hi, introduce yourself. But I want to encourage all of you in the room, and the chat box is an opportunity for you to utilize the chat box. But in the chat box, please share your name, your title, your organization, especially your location, so you kind of get a sense of where folks are from around the country. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. Look at all these wonderful people. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And of course, there are other folks who are still arriving. So welcome to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on mobilizing marginalized men. Please feel free to take a few minutes and introduce yourself in the chat box. A lot of really wonderful people. It's going by really quickly. There's a lot of folks with us already, but feel free to scroll through and to see who's joined us this morning. A lot of really good folks from a lot of different organizations around the country. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. So welcome to all of you. And again, if you need any assistance or if you have any questions or comments or any insights, or if you have a resource, an article of interest, a website, research, anything that you'd like to share, any questions that you might have during today's webinar, feel free to post them inside of the chat room. And I will hopefully we'll be able to respond to all the questions and comments. And if not, we'll definitely make an effort. Please reach out to me again via email or via social media, and I will definitely make an effort to respond to any questions or comments or any feedback that you have about today's webinar. So again, thank you so much for joining us, especially for folks here in Texas and around the country. We're going to have an opportunity to sort of get a sense of where folks are from. And so I'm going to run a couple polls, actually 4 polls. So I'm going to launch them one at a time. So I'll just take a few minutes to answer them. So the first question is, where are you from geographically? Just let us know where you are from. 4 options. It's looking like just take a few minutes to complete the poll. Let's see if we can get to 100%. Give you a few more seconds to complete the poll if you haven't already. We're going to get a sense of who's with us today. 80%. Come on, we can get to 100%. I believe we can. We'd love to know where you're from. So if you could just take a few minutes and share with us where you're from geographically. All right. So I don't know if y'all can see it, but 11% of our folks who are on today's webinar are from Texas. So howdy to all of our fellow Texans. And the majority of you are from outside of Texas. So thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. So we're always happy to have friends and colleagues from around the country joining us. There's about 2% of folks on today's webinar who are outside of the United States. So thank you so much for joining us. That's really great. We're glad that, and if you are not from the United States, please share with us where you're from. Oh, thank you, Patrick. Let's share that. There we go. Thank you, Patrick, for that reminder. That way y'all can see. So we're a really diverse group of folks. So let's, oops. Sorry about this, folks. I don't know what I did. All right. Little technical difficulties on my end. Here we go. All right, next poll question. Where do you work organizationally? So if you've just joined us, please introduce yourself in the chat box, but also participate in the poll. Let us know where do you work organizationally. So the 4 options are rape crisis centers, state sexual assault, domestic violence coalitions, K-12 schools, colleges and universities, and other. Give you a few more seconds to complete that poll. We'd love to know where you kind of organizations you're with. All right. So as you can see, 15% of the folks who are here are with rape crisis centers. 15% are with state sexual assault, domestic violence coalitions. So welcome to our sister coalitions. Unfortunately, today we don't have any folks from schools that are K through 12. And in addition to that, we have about 13% of folks who are from colleges and universities and 55% of others. So definitely, if you haven't introduced yourself already, please check out where folks are from, and we'll get it sort of, you'll be able to get an idea of where, what organizations folks are from. So thank you for participating in that poll. All right, next one. So what groups of boys and men are you currently working with? So always curious about that on webinars, and just sort of to get a sense of when we think about this particular group of boys, we know that this doesn't represent all of the boys and men in our communities, but I just wanted to get a sense of these 4 categories or groups of men where the majority of folks are working and who they're working with. I'll give you a few more seconds to complete the poll. And during today's webinar, I want to encourage you just to make a note, especially of this particular poll, just so as we continue this conversation, you have a sense of where folks are currently working. So let's poll, and let me share it with you. So you'll see that 58% of folks on today's webinar are working with Latino boys and men, or folks who 53% who are working with African American boys and men. 21% of folks are working with Indigenous or Native American boys and men. 53% are also working with gay and bisexual or transgender boys and men. So evenly split. And then 72%, the majority of folks on today's webinar are working with other groups of boys and men. So inside of the chat box, if you could share which particular group of boys and men you're primarily working with, we'd love to learn a little bit about the groups of boys and men that you're working with. So feel free to share that inside of the chat box. And then the final one is what type of men's engagement work are you doing? So the options are campaigns, discussion groups, workshops, trainings, and others. I'll give you a few minutes to complete that. I'll give you a few more seconds to complete the poll if you haven't already. If you've just joined us, welcome to today's webinar. All right. So 7% of you are working on some form of campaigns with boys and men. 30% of you are working in some sort of some type of discussion groups. 21% of you are working primarily utilizing workshops as your primary engagement with boys and men. 19% of you conduct trainings with boys and men. And then 23% of you provide some other form of engagement. So again, it's a great opportunity because I think webinars are also an opportunity for us in terms of creating a community of practice. Lots of folks that are working with, one of the things I noticed, a lot of folks working with the API community, the Asian Pacific Islander community. So yeah, there are a lot of really amazing work happening around the country and of course around the world. And so thank you so much for sharing a little bit about the work that you do. And it's also, like I said earlier, an opportunity for you to network and to connect with other folks who are doing similar work to you around the country or around the world. So again, feel free to continue to share and share your contact information with each other and hopefully connect through today's webinar and be absolutely a resource for each other. And so again, thank you so much for participating in those polls. It gives us an idea of who's on today's webinar, and we're glad that all of you are with us today. And that is true. There are a lot of, it's hard to just choose one, because we know that most folks, I do want to acknowledge that most folks are working with multiple communities. And so I think it's a little hard to pick and choose. But yeah, feel free to continue to share and inside of the chat box, and please, again, let my program know if you have any questions or comments and or any concerns. In addition, Dukes is inside of the chat room as well. So thank you both so much for helping me this morning, and so really happy that you're here. All right, so let's jump in. As folks arrive, we can begin having this conversation about why marginalized men, why are we having this particular webinar today? I'm a huge fan. I don't know about most folks on today's webinar, but I've been following Homeland from the first season on HBO, and I thought it sort of sort of an appropriate example of why we um, why why we're having today's conversation about marginalized men, and sort of want to make a really important point before we get started, that my intention for having this conversation is not because we believe that the majority of men who are part of marginalized communities are committing the majority of sexual violence or violence against women and children. And so this is definitely an opportunity for us to highlight and to focus on those individuals who are marginalized in our country. And that's the intent of today's webinar, is to bring those, to highlight the work that is happening within marginalized communities, but also to recognize that because of the political climate right now, individuals who are part of marginalized communities are being even more marginalized, and puts them at greater risk for violence and depression. And so want to acknowledge that those things exist, and that it really, again, is an opportunity for us to really highlight the work that is being done in those communities, and to be intentional about honoring and appreciating and valuing that has already been done, primarily by women of color who are part of those marginalized communities, but slowly those boys and men have begun to come around and to begin to join the work that those girls and women have been doing longer than we have. So I want to acknowledge and recognize their leadership in these efforts, and that the only reason that we're talking about this issue is because of them, and really is intended to ensure that the girls and women in those communities are empowered, and that we encourage healthy relationships in all of our communities, but especially really highlight the examples of how folks in marginalized communities are doing that. So anyway, back to Homeland. I think if we use Homeland sort of as an example of sort of these, Homeland has had issues for a long time with Islamophobia and its representation of Muslims, both here in the United States and around the world, on the show. And you know, this last season has sort of was a shift in sort of the tone of the show. And so if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend watching this season. But it presents the storyline presents a really interesting sort of reality for Muslim men in this country, especially young men, and the radicalization and the relationship with law enforcement. And so there's a lot of really important themes throughout the season. But one of the things that comes across is Sekou, who is one of the main characters of this season. We sort of begin to learn in terms of his radicalization, and his he is son of a Somali immigrants who he's beginning to be radicalized and is very outspoken about his views, and so becomes a target by the FBI. I'm not going to spoil this season, but I definitely encourage you to watch it. But I think it's a really important example of how men who are part of marginalized communities, specifically Muslim communities, are stereotyped and identified as being extremist or being open to radicalization. And then I wanted to pose that the opposing sort of message that we don't get through mainstream, or that we see a lot of, is that Muslim men are organizing and believe in women's rights, and are doing a tremendous amount of work in their communities around this particular issue. And I definitely want to hear from folks on today's webinar that as we talk about these communities that are marginalized here in the United States specifically, examples of what these communities are doing, what you're doing in your own community with these groups of men. So I want to encourage you to do that, but I thought that was a really important example to share, that these sort of counter stories and counter messages that we don't hear about men in these marginalized communities. And I'm sure there are other examples of that, both in popular culture, that you are welcome to share inside the chat box. But this is sort of the storyline in Homeland on HBO. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out. But that's an important place to start. So let's talk about which men I'm talking about, and when I say marginalized, which men. So I'm sure folks are familiar with what is called the power chart that's developed, and I've adapted Paul Kibble's power chart, and so we're just going to review, sort of utilizing the power chart, sort of to get an idea of which men are part of, which men are marginalized within our society here in the United States. So the folks on the left-hand side of your screen are folks that are in positions of power or authority or have more privilege in our society. And so the first group of folks is adults. And so if you're an adult, you have a tremendous amount of power and privilege. If you're an adult man, you have a lot more power and privilege in our society. And then on the opposing side of that is children and our elders or seniors, those folks who are part of these communities in terms of have been marginalized or silenced or ignored, so et cetera, in our society, either politically, economically, that they experience all kinds of oppressive violence by the state, and we could go on and on. So just sort of to get us an idea of where we're going. So men who are cisgender men, men who are those men who are cisgender, and then of course on the opposing side, men who identify as trans or transmasculine, and this includes boys and as well. And so those are the folks who, on the right-hand side, who experience can experience who are at risk of oppression and violence and discrimination and all kinds of forms of violence and abuse. As well, in terms of our society, folks with little power. So you have folks who are rich, and then you have folks who are poor. So folks who are part of poor communities. You have white men, and of course you have men of color. So anybody, you could still be a man within society and still have a tremendous amount of privilege and power and authority compared to if we were doing the traditional power chart. You would have men, and then on the other side, women. And so in the context of our conversation today, white men have a lot more power and privilege than men of color in our society. Those individuals who are bosses, who are owners, supervisors, people who oversee or direct, managers, those individuals, and of course workers on the other side. So these are individuals that work for individuals or businesses or corporations, or these are workers in factories and the fields and different industries around the country who have very little power compared to those folks who are bosses and owners of corporations and businesses. And then, of course, men who identify as heterosexual, and then on the opposing end, we have men who identify as gay, bisexual, who are queer. We have those men who have less power in our society politically and economically, and etc. And then we have folks who are able-bodied, and then of course folks on the other end who are disabled, who have some sort of disability, some sort of physical disability, mental disability, some other invisible disability. So individuals that live with some form of disability in our society and don't have the same sort of access that folks who are able-bodied have. People who are formally educated, who have graduated from high school, have gone to secondary and higher education, so folks who have a degree, those types of individuals. And then of course we have folks who are non-formally educated, so who are educated on the street, who are educated by their elders, who are educated, who might have a GED, or who might be in an ESL program, or some technical, you have gone through some sort of technical school, so et cetera. There's all kinds of examples of folks who are non-formally educated. It could be very informal education and apprenticeships, and so those sorts of examples, those are all forms of education as well. And then individuals who are born in the United States, citizens of this country, and those individuals, so when we're talking about, for the purposes of today's webinar, we're including all the folks on the right-hand side of the screen. And those individuals who are immigrants, who are recent immigrants to this country, who are refugees, who are living in this country and working in this country, who have left their native countries because of violence or oppression. And then finally, individuals who are Christian, and then of course on the other end, individuals who are Islamic, Jewish, Buddhist, who are any sort of non-Christian or non-believers in terms of, like, who don't believe in Christianity, who don't have any particular faith, people who are atheists, and the other folks that are just not identifying as Christian. So again, our focus for today's webinar are the folks on the right-hand side, and we are not going to be talking about them all specifically. And so one of the things that I do want to acknowledge is that I will be speaking in generalizations and not about a specific group of boys and men on the right-hand side, but I'm hoping that what I share with you today will be applicable to most, if not all, of these different communities. I do want to acknowledge that it's critical and important for us to develop very specific, that there have been and there are specific strategies and programs and curriculums and training, and there's been a lot developed for all of these particular groups of folks who are part of marginalized communities here in the United States. And so one of the things I want to encourage you to do is, as we talk about some of the key components of sort of effective prevention programming with men who are part of marginalized communities, I want to encourage you to share sort of those very specific examples for these groups, these individual groups of boys and men. I think that's really important, that we sort of get a sense of what's happening with these individual groups of boys and men. So I want to encourage you to do that. Does anybody have any questions or comments about sort of understand sort of where we're at or where we're going with this? I wanted to welcome the folks who just joined us. Please feel free to introduce yourself inside of the chat box and share your name, your title, your organization, your location. Thank you so much for joining us today. But do folks have any questions or comments about this before we move on? It's just a way for us to sort of we're all on the same page for today's webinar in terms of who we're talking about on this particular, on today's webinar. And of course, would encourage you, if you're familiar with other webinars about any of these specific communities in terms of engaging men around sexual violence prevention, to please share them if you're familiar with any upcoming trainings or webinars or resources specific to any community that I don't mention. Of course, these categories are real. They're general, and they include a lot of different folks. And so some are more specific than others. But you know, when we say men of color, that's a very large group of folks. And so definitely want to encourage you to share. So the first component, so as sort of what we're talking about, and of course I want you to share comments or any feedback that you have or any insight you have or in terms of your experience. One of the things that is key and for us to understand and is an important component in working with marginalized communities is that for most, not all, I would say, and again, I don't want to speak in absolutes or generalizations, but I will do my best to sort of frame this in a way that's applicable. But relationships, I think, are critical to most of these communities, and centering those relationships that folks have sort of is key. And especially if we are not part of that particular community. And which usually is the case unless we're a culturally specific organization that's working with a culturally specific community, then we already have a very defined end. And there's a lot of those organizations that exist throughout the country that are culturally specific, that are working with that particular community. But I think it's just a pretty, it's just pretty given in terms of centering our relationships with each other, the relationships that folks have with their elders, with women, with children, with their families, with their extended families. All of those relationships, I think, are at the center of the relationship with coworkers and people of their faith, people who live in their communities, people in their places of worship. All of these, I think, relationships are key. As somebody who is part of a marginalized community, and I did want to say that I'm speaking from a place of, as a member of, as a man who is part of a marginalized community, but also in terms of a lot of this is sort of informed from the work that I've done with folks who are working with culturally specific communities, with boys and men around the country, around sexual violence and domestic violence, dating violence prevention work. And so a lot of these are just sort of the key sort of components that I've picked up from my work with those individuals and organizations around the country. But again, might not necessarily apply to all of the communities that you serve, or might not be as important as they are to some of those communities. So I just want to acknowledge that. So centering those relationships, I think, are key, at least for me and for most communities, is the relationship that we have and establishing trust and the value that we have in relationships, our ability to seek out assistance. And right now, I think, but in terms of the political climate in this country, as it affects a lot of these individual communities, those folks will really seek support from their community, and won't, unfortunately, seek support or help outside of that community. And we've heard examples of that in the media, how folk reporting from particular communities is around sexual violence and other acts of family violence are decreasing because folks are afraid of coming forward and reporting the violence that they've either witnessed or experienced to law enforcement because they're afraid of being detained and deported. So there's definitely a lot happening around the country, and I think that's why relationships are so critical right now in terms of being able to understand that folks are going to seek out support from their own community and from each other before they come to your organization to access support, training, resources, or just the basic services that most folks on today's webinar provide. And so I think it's important just for us to understand that the political climate is definitely having an impact on these communities to different degrees, but that folks are getting help and again the support that they need primarily from their family members and their neighbors and their communities of faith, and from the neighborhoods that they live in that are primarily culturally specific and speak their traditional languages. And so, but I think in terms of our ability to work with these men, we have to understand how important those relationships are, and that it takes time to build trust with those men, with those boys and men, and with the elders in that particular community, and for us to understand sort of to sort of overcome, because it's not them necessarily having to overcome those cultural barriers. It's really us who need to sort of understand that particular community and learn about and to be in and to research and not necessarily and just to be in those communities and to be with people. I think is really critical in order for us to be able to do any effective prevention programming with boys and men in terms of understanding who are the gatekeepers in that community, understanding the role that girls and women have. And again, the reality is that most of these initiatives, these efforts that this particular webinar is really because of the profound and important work that women of color, women who are part of these marginalized communities have done before me, and who have mentored me and who sort of have taught me to do this work. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that a lot of what we know in terms of engaging boys and men really comes from women, and especially women of color. And I think that's really critical to acknowledge. So yeah, just centering those relationships I think are really valuable and important, and I would encourage you to consider what's the best way to do that. Folks have any questions or comments? Sort of like the chat room is sort of stalled out, I've noticed. And so I noticed I'm sure folks are really paying really great attention and listening to my voice, which I really appreciate. But I'd love to hear from folks when we think about this idea of centering relationships, does that speak to you? Are there sort of examples that you'd like to share with the rest of the audience? All right, well, let's move on. So feel free to do that throughout. So one of the things that I think is another important component, again, like I was saying earlier, as part of that relationship building, establishing trust, which could potentially take time. So engaging these particular communities doesn't happen overnight. It really requires patience and our willingness to commit our time and our resources in terms of staff and our own capacity to work with these particular marginalized communities of boys and men, and to build relationships. In order for us to identify leadership, we have to have those relationships in place. And I think that's key, is identifying again who are the key stakeholders, who are the gatekeepers in that community, who are the elders and the individuals, the imams and the pastors, or the priests, those individuals who have some leadership and some authority in the community. It could be one of the elders, one of the women who's highly regarded in the community, one of the male elders. Like those folks right? Identifying leadership, and leadership doesn't look like our traditional sort of leadership. These are individuals who have an important role and function in the community, who are business owners and who are community organizers and who are activists. These are individuals that we don't necessarily, when we think about the word, when we think about leadership, doesn't sort of necessarily align nicely with the idea of leadership, but these individuals have a tremendous amount of power and authority in a particular community. And so sort of seeking them out and having conversations with them and learning about them and understanding their role in their particular community, I think is really critical. So, you know, just building those relationships, establishing, you know, having those conversations, really being patient and listening and learning as much as you can, rather than sort of coming to the table with sort of an agenda. I think most of us are pretty accustomed to saying, you know, we got funding to do X, Y, and Z, and so we're here to do X, Y, and Z, rather than really allowing the folks in that particular community to lead the programming, our prevention efforts. So identifying leadership, it can be tricky, but asking people who else I should talk to, like, you know, after you've had those conversations, who else should I meet with? Who else can you connect me with? I think are really important parts of fully engaging that community, because those communities tend to be isolated, and both geographically and economically, and it's really important that you sort of go into the community and spend time with folks. And but I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of mistrust, and you know, there might be a history of abuse in the past by organizations, and so they might be reluctant to work with you or to partner with you. And so part of it is just really proving ourselves and taking the time to be honest about what our intentions are, and identifying you know, those individuals in that particular community, and then hopefully going from there and sort of establishing new relationships. And again, those things take time. As part of our efforts in terms of developing those networks and being really intentional about like what our intentions are and what we'd like to be able to do, is really working and partnering with those communities to help develop culturally informed prevention programming, right? So that we're not coming with something that's sort of in the box, and really, but we're really working with communities to develop culturally and linguistically informed prevention programmings that is informed by the members of that community, from like a range of folks in that community, both from the boys and men that you're trying to engage, but also the elders and the women and other traditional leaders in a particular community or group of marginalized folks. I will tell you, this is time intensive, and this requires a tremendous amount of it requires a lot of meetings, and it requires a lot of relationship building and being sort of opening and willing to listen and to partner with folks to feel like that they're genuine partners in terms of developing you know, this type of programming. So Dara asks, what does culturally linguistically competent work look like, right? That's a great question. Yeah, I'm curious to hear from the audience, like when I say that, sort of what comes to mind for you, especially folks who are working with these communities. But I think for me, you know, how does the programming, how does it incorporate traditions and practices of that particular group of individuals that we're trying to engage? So, for example, the picture of Indigenous and Native American men around a drum circle, and utilizing sort of the traditions, the values, the storytelling, of just the tradition of the drum circle, the role that boys and men have in drum circles. I think sort of using those sort of like parts of traditions and cultures and incorporating them into our programming, where there's actually programming, like if we're developing a curriculum or activities, that we incorporate those traditional practices and into our programming, that we actually write that into the curriculum and develop that again in partnership, that's constantly informed by the folks in that particular community. So yeah, a lot of folks are sharing some really good feedback. Langston shared a good example in adoption of Boys and Men. The program was being used in Orthodox Jewish communities, had language around healthy dating behaviors, the challenge of young people. So I think that's a really great example. I'm going to share some of those later on in today's webinar. And Miriam shared speaking to survivors in their native language, treating them like unique individuals instead of generalizing their experiences. And absolutely, so thank you, Miriam, in terms of helping us understand that they're absolutely different. You know, folks who are part of these marginalized communities, depending on where they live and where they reside in this country, are real different. You know, there are real differences in communities and experiences. And so, you know, Feng sharing some really good example from the community. I understand how the experiences of domestic violence and sexual assault manifest in their community, right? Just having someone or people from the community does not necessarily mean those folks are competent in their community, and how those patriarchal practices manifest in the community. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think that all of those things I think are true, and I think have to be really considered. And part of identifying leadership is absolutely training the leadership and training those individuals, and sort of being able to provide the context and the understanding of this particular issue. So so that's an important step. So I appreciate that. So wow, a lot of good stuff. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That idea of coming into a community as opposed to being part of it already and fostering community leadership rather than offering answers, right? So I think really seeking out solutions from individuals, you know, that are part of that particular community, and so I really appreciate those points. I think those are really important to consider, I think, in terms of our planning and how we approach these particular communities, and what are some of the considerations that we have to take before we engage a particular community. So there's work absolutely sort of on the front end before we sort of just show up and start working or try to partner with a community or to create something with a particular community. So there's a tremendous amount of work that we have to do. Also on ourselves, I think somebody talked about in terms of addressing our own biases and our own understanding of that particular community. I think that's sort of critical work, and that's sort of the work that we have to do with our own teams of prevention educators, and absolutely has to start with ourselves and our willingness to address our own homophobia, our own transphobia, our own Islamophobia, our own racism. Like all of those things I think are really critical and key in terms of if we want to be successful, then we have to be willing to take a hard look at ourselves and address some of the biases that we might have before we even start approaching a particular community. So yeah, I don't know, cultural humility. Bella shared cultural humility also suggests that we are, as others have already said, the experts about the communities we're engaged with. Yeah. So yeah, I definitely think it's important for us to acknowledge that the folks in terms of this room, just if we think about the folks in this room, there's a tremendous amount of expertise, probably you know, and that's why we're here to share as a community of practice in terms of sharing our expertise with other folks who are doing or who want to do similar work. So I think that's really important. But that we absolutely don't have all the answers, and that we don't have all the solutions, and that those solutions have to be community driven and community based, and have to be informed by people who are part of that particular community. So thank you all for that. So you know, one of the things I think is critical in terms of once we've developed that prevention programming, those activities, that campaign, those trainings, those workshops, those discussions, whatever in terms of programming that we've developed, it's critical that we have some form of evaluation, that we're constantly evaluating, and that evaluation is culturally informed and is ideally conducted by participants, and is again linguistically and culturally appropriate, and appropriate for the education of that particular, like in terms of their ability to, one of the things that I was involved with Migrant Clinicians Network in terms of developing a primary prevention program with migrant farm workers. One of the realities for that particular group around evaluation was that in terms of evaluating the prevention programming that migrant health organizations around the country were conducting in migrant health camps or migrant work camps. So a lot of individuals were illiterate and so they developed an evaluation that really addressed some of those issues for that particular community. Not that the majority of workers are illiterate, but that is definitely a reality, and that also was linguistically appropriate in terms of relevant to their own experiences in the language that they spoke. And so the sort of those considerations in terms of developing evaluation tools that that are responsive to the particular needs, and that really measure and evaluate the success and sort of the places that we can constantly improve. And that's sort of an ongoing process. I'm not an expert in any regards around evaluation. That's why Maya's on today's webinar. Well, not the reason why Maya's on the webinar, but Maya is our evaluation manager and has a tremendous amount of expertise in this area, and is a really great resource. So definitely, I hope Maya will share her contact information if that's something that she has done a tremendous amount of thinking around this particular issue. And so, yeah, she shared her. Thank you, Maya, for sharing your contact information. So, yeah, there's a lot of, I think, some considerations in terms of development around evaluation, and you know, it's an important component that can be developed with folks, not, you know, in terms of people who don't have any relationship to these particular communities, but can really be informed by folks who are part of these marginalized communities. So I think one of the things that really sticks out to me that I think is really critical is this issue of accountability, and building into our prevention programming with these marginalized communities a practice of accountability, both as individuals as well as sort of in groups of boys and men that we're working with, at the core, that we are accountable, especially to girls and women of that particular community, whether it's you know, particularly, like if we use the example of refugees, that the work that we're doing with refugees, boys and men, is really centered and is accountable to refugee girls and women, and not necessarily to sort of, it's important in terms of to be accountable to broader communities. But I think for the purposes of this webinar, it's to think about and to build in accountability, and at the core, what does that look like in terms of what's the practice around accountability? How do we engage in you know, and necessarily not defining that, but really allowing those girls and women who are trans women, other you know, women and girls who are part of that particular marginalized community be able to define what they would like and how they would like for boys and men to be held accountable. And the reality is that there, in most of these communities, there are already systems in place to hold individuals accountable that are traditional and historical. And I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of these systems already exist in those communities, and that we have to really respect and to value those, the sort of really rich history of accountability of boys and men in that particular community, that those things already, those practices already exist. And so how can we sort of reinforce and encourage, like, support those practices, but also to constantly center and folks who unfortunately who are the primary victims of boys and men's violence, and really centering those individuals, the voices of those individuals, the voices of victims and survivors, the voices of our elders, the voices of individuals who have been directly impacted by boys and men's violence. And I think accountability is it can be hard for us to talk about, but I think but also in terms of our own practice, right? Like, I know it's something that I think is for me personally, that I constantly have to reflect on and to be reminded of, and to open myself up to accountability and really establish practices with the communities that I'm part of. And I think really, again, rather than this sort of, because of the accountability in these particular communities definitely don't look like sort of traditional or mainstream accountability within the movement. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, for most folks, because of the political climate, they might not. So for some folks, accountability of individuals who are committing acts of violence might be calling the police and filing charges and getting involved with the criminal justice system, or reporting that victimization, those types of things, and holding those individuals accountable. Because of the political climate right now, for most of these marginalized communities, is not a safe alternative to accountability. It's not like their go-to accountability. So I'm really curious to hear from folks in the room what accountability looks like for your community that you're working with, how folks are holding boys and men accountable. Is this something that you've really seen impacted by the political climate, or here in the United States, or are there other systems of accountability that you can share with us, or sort of traditional practices within a particular community of accountability, what those look like? I'm really curious to hear from folks in the room what they think about accountability and what their experiences have been. So I'll give you a few minutes to share that inside of the chat room. Also, if you've read something, or if you've read an article, or have come across a research around accountability with particular communities, or I definitely would love to hear about that. It's definitely worth sharing on today's webinar. And so, you know, if folks don't have any other thoughts, I'll go ahead and move on. But I know that this is, the practice of accountability is going to look different in those different communities. And again, I think at the core of that need to be informed by everyone, including young people in those communities. We write open letters to men in our community. So I think that's something we've seen. And for folks that are familiar with open letters, you know, you can find them primarily on social media. But I think that that's a really great example, and it's not necessarily sharing them on social media unless you want to hold an individual accountable at that sort of level, but that's a really great example. So, Feng shared, in terms of the power of shaming, works in some communities, losing face. I think that shaming can be a really important strategy and can be part of traditional cultural practices for some communities and can be effective. But again, that's not necessarily going to be true for other communities. And I think really identifying what's going to be what's strategic and what's safe for the victim and for the family, and I think all of those things I think are really critical considerations in terms of the safety of individuals, the safety of victims and survivors. Not that we would allow individuals to sort of get away with abusive behavior or oppressive or problematic behavior, but right, let's think of like what are some ways that we can address accountability in those communities without, and again, always going to the state in terms of law enforcement or because of folks' fear of deportation or detention and deportation. So admitting you're wrong, taking time to learn from others, not taking it as personal criticism, but rather as growth opportunity. So Tyler, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Bella. I think if there are folks who want to share sort of examples of traditional practices of accountability, so from men and boys. Yeah, I love your example, like truthfulness, apologizing to the entire congregation, your neighborhood, your family, leading to mentoring from elders, powerful voices within the communities. I think those are really great examples. So at the core, the what is sort of what does justice look like for those communities, right? And what do again, always the victim or the person who's been abused or has experienced some form of violence or abuse or oppression. What is it that they want? How does that inform sort of the accountability of that individual or individuals? Individual groups of boys and men. So yeah, I'd love to hear from folks that are working with very specific, culturally specific communities, what that looks like for you, sort of what are some of the practices around accountability. I don't think that there is like sort of, the point of the slide is not to say that there is just a one way. I think there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different practices, and that those have to be informed by those. But I think, again, centering the victim and the person who's been abused, I think is really key in those communities. Modeling. Hey, Denise, welcome. So Denise is one of our primary prevention specialists. So Denise shared, I think accountability also is important in our own everyday lives with our loved ones, our friends, our coworkers, etc. We often commit violence in the form of microaggressions as well. It's really true. So thank you for sharing that. Calling out your own friends and colleagues for rape jokes, victim blaming. Yeah, absolutely. Yvette shared, what I've noticed within the Latino community is in Minnesota is more of a lack of accountability. Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. The reason I share that in terms of really getting us to think about what that looks like and ensuring that that's sort of a component of any prevention programming that we're doing with boys and men that are part of these communities, whether it's with trans boys and men or Asian Pacific Islander men or Native or Indigenous men. So like that, this is a key component in terms of as we're developing, as we're practicing, in terms of the actions that boys and men are taking, that accountability is definitely part of that. Miriam shared restorative justice where community gets involved to help the situation instead of law enforcement. There's a lot of really great examples of that. making sure that being visible about the accountability means being able to not have those men be in leadership positions or supporting them in a visible, or not supporting them in visible ways in the community. Yes, thank you. The idea of decolonizing justice. Wow. That's great. I found that peers, Cheryl shared, I have found that peers, empowering peers to do the right thing is helpful. What has shared, accountability practices must also include elements of love and forgiveness. So true, right? For a lot of these people who are part of these communities, including myself, and for a lot of folks who are part of these marginalized communities, yeah, love and forgiveness, I think, are part of our traditions and our practices and our faith, sort of our key component to accountability, but it's not the sort of the, you know, it's important to understand all of that. Oh, look at all these really good. Bella, thank you for sharing that. Yes, so there's a lot of really good stuff there that I definitely encourage you to continue to share out and to think about, and that's really my intention, is for folks to really think about what this particular, what accountability looks like, and what does the practice of accountability look like as sort of a key component of any of our prevention programming with these boys and men. So one of the things that I think is really exciting and interesting that's happening is that there's been a lot of the development of these culturally specific programming and practices, you know, sort of curriculum development, campaigns, materials. There's been a lot of really great stuff that has been developed around these communities, and one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is to sort of share examples of that. I don't think my list is exhaustive in any way, but I think for folks who are really looking for guidance in terms of being able to develop their own content material, the key of inviting our community to share the dissemination of those materials, of those curriculums, I think is really key in terms of being able to access and to pay for training. Like I said earlier, you know, there's a lot of, there's going to be some examples that I'm going to share of folks who have disseminated and who are sharing out what they've learned from those practices, and training other folks in terms of training peer facilitators and men who are part, like boys and men who are part of those communities, to then facilitate those activities, or to take action with girls and women around these issues. And so the training of individuals who are engaged in the work, I think, is really critical. That sort of ongoing training, the ongoing mentorship, you know, and again, acknowledging that the folks who are primarily doing this work have been girls and women in these communities, and there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from them, and that's primarily where our training comes from. But getting boys and men to then train their peers and to disseminate what they've learned in terms of their practices, and having opportunities to practice what they're learning with their peers, and to be able to get feedback sort of on an ongoing basis from both their peers and from other sort of influencers in that community and mentors. And I think all of that sort of is really key in terms of the success, in terms of the development and the evaluation long-term of these programs that are just as effective as anything that the mainstream offers us. And I think that's really, for me, that's key, right? Is that most of what we learn and know comes from the mainstream violence prevention sort of movement, and that these programs, these activities, the materials that are being developed and the activities that are being done in these communities aren't necessarily haven't always moved into the mainstream, and don't get the sort of this sort of support, like the funding and the sort of evaluation that some of those mainstream programs get. The programming that's happening in these communities, it's very rich and really well developed and very effective. They'll get the same sort of spotlight and attention that a lot of other programs. We could probably share a list of programs and examples programs that are part of the mainstream around engaging boys and men. But there's a lot that has been developed in these communities, whether it's from work that's being done with trans boys and men, work that's being done with the API community or the Latino community. We could just go down the list of folks who are part of marginalized communities. I think there are examples, and again, my list is not exhaustive, and I definitely want to encourage you to share them on today's webinar. But I think there's a lot of really great examples and a lot of really exciting stuff happening that's being developed with very little to no resources from federal state governments or from local foundations and corporations. And so I think it's important to acknowledge and celebrate and to share those really exciting, innovative programs, because they're just as valuable and just as important to the work as the stuff that's part of that we see and hear about all the time in the mainstream. So speaking about that, what are some additional strategies that you found effective in mobilizing marginalized men? So if you think about the community, we talked a little bit about, like, as part of folks' introduction today, if you could just share one thing, a particular strategy that you found effective, whether it's working with trans boys and men or with men who are Latino or men who are part of the API community, or so any community that you're working with, I'd love for you to share out one strategy that you found very effective. And I know it's hard to sort of synthesize a particular strategy because there's lots of different components into that, but what is one strategy you have found effective working with your community? If you could share that in the chat room, that would be super awesome. I'd love to be able to compile these and share those out on social media. So if you have a particular strategy that, I know folks are probably typing right now, but there's something that comes to mind. That you'd be willing to share with the audience. And again, this doesn't have to be something that's been tried and tested, that's sound, that's been evaluated. Like, it's something that you in your own work are finding to be really effective that you want to share with folks. And again, this is a community of practice, and so like what can we learn from you in terms of your own work with a particular community that we can apply to our own work as well. So I want to encourage you to share that out, and I'm going to move on because of time. So some of the resources that I just wanted to highlight, again, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are probably a lot of really great resources out there that I'm not familiar with, and this is the place where I really want you to share those things out. If you have a link to a particular resource or a video or anything that you think is relevant, that's shareable, please do that here, and I will definitely share that out on social media after today's webinar. But some of the resources that I wanted to highlight that I find to be really useful. One of the things that I have found useful in terms of my own development, in terms of thinking about these issues, is a lot of the writing, for example, by bell hooks, in terms of this particular book and other books by bell hooks and other women of color, I think have been really sort of key in terms of my own development and my thinking around this particular issue and my look at masculinity and look at sexual violence and those communities that I'm part of. But I think I have responded really well to these sort of memoirs, these short stories, these books that sort of don't, that are not research like. And not that there's anything wrong with those books. I think those are important to familiarize ourselves with in terms of masculinities and the research that's been done around this particular area. There's been very little research done on these particular groups of boys and men. And so if you have those books that you'd like to share that I think are really useful. Muy Macho is sort of a collection of short stories that was edited by Ray Gonzalez. Of course, Bell Hooks and some of the other books that she has written I think are really relevant and important. I think because most of like a strategy in a particular group of men, that like a a way of engaging boys and men, or boys and men who identify as fathers or father figures. You know, so Rad Dads, I think, is a really great sort of collection of short stories by primarily men of color and men who are part of marginalized communities. So definitely check that out, and it's edited by Tomas Moniz. And then, of course, Carlos Andres Gomez, his memoir, Man Up, I think is a really, one of my favorite personal sort of memoirs that really spoke to me. And I think there are other examples of that. So if you have other examples of books that have really spoken to you, or spoken to the men that you're working with in a particular community, please share that out, because clearly my list is not exhaustive. And there are probably other things that I should be reading, and that other folks who are wanting to work and who are part of these communities should read as well. So please take a few minutes and share out any books that you would recommend. There's some really amazing publications out there around engaging boys and men, and there's not a lot in terms of speak to the, but I wanted to share just sort of a couple. You know, one of my favorite national publications is Voicemail, and this particular issue should be of interest. It's specifically about women's empowerment and how men can be allies, and so it's available online as well as a print copy. So it's a quarterly national publication. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend getting a subscription and sharing it with the boys and men that you're working with. And there's always a lot of really relevant, interesting articles to our work, and I think it's a fantastic publication. Now, clearly, there aren't enough voices of men of color and men who are boys and men who are part of marginalized communities in Voicemail. So I would highly recommend, if you've done some writing and thinking about this issue, definitely contact the editor at Voicemail and see if he'll publish some of your work. So I'd love to see more men who are part of these marginalized communities, more men of color whose voices are not always heard. Again, this in mainstream publications like Voicemail. The Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs has developed some really great materials around prevention. They're working Washington State, as you can imagine, if you're from Washington, your state yourself, there's a really diverse, lot of really diverse communities there in Washington State. So they've developed some really amazing content specific to different communities. But I think this is one of my favorite collections of sort of resources and strategies around engaging men. It's not necessarily specific to any particular group of men, but I find this particular publication to be really helpful, and I wanted to share it with you. So definitely download a copy of that. The Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition has developed a new resource that was funded primarily from the Office of Violence Against Women, the Engaging Men Project. So they've developed a really great video discussion guide specifically called Making Space to Rise, and it's to engage Native men and boys about challenging sexual violence. So it's very specific to sexual violence and using media to engage in conversations about this issue with Native boys and men. So definitely check out that resource from Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And then the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence has created a really useful, that I think is applicable, can also be applicable to our work around sexual violence prevention. And so they've created this guide on engaging Asian men, divesting from gender violence and investing in gender equality. So I think it's a really fantastic publication that can be really, really useful in terms of guiding some of the work within the API community. Definitely check that out. And I can't, if there is sort of a mirror resource like that around sexual violence prevention, I'd love for you to share that as well. So if you have an example of that. So I definitely want to give folks an opportunity to share out those examples if you have them. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm really curious to hear what folks are using in terms of publications and resources and curriculums, that you're utilizing that have really informed the work that you're doing with your particular community. Some additional resources that's specifically to media, films, documentaries. Now, clearly there are others, and I'd love to hear from folks if there are specific examples of resources for particular communities. But also out of the same grant from the Office of Violence Against Women, the Engaging Men Project, came My Masculinity Helps from the North Carolina Sexual Assault Coalition. So definitely check that out. It's a fantastic film about African American boys and men in terms of masculinity and violence, sexual violence in those communities. So it's a fantastic film, and it includes sort of a discussion guide as well. The Mask You Live In, I think folks are pretty familiar with that. It's available on Netflix, and hopefully folks have seen it by now. But I think it's an important conversation starter. There's not very specific, like it's a very general film about masculinity in the United States, but I think some of it can be really applicable to the communities that we work with. What's hard is finding films that are exclusively in a particular language or have been written or produced by a particular community. So if you have those examples, please share them. I'd love to learn more about them and to be able to add them to my list of resources. Of course, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes by Byron Hurt. This is a pretty dated film, but I think it's still relevant. Hip hop is still an important part of our culture and communities, and most of these communities, and so the discussion around hip hop, and I think, is really useful. And then Scenarios USA has developed a series of films that are really that include a lot of stories that are written by girls and girls of color, and that are really about men of color, right? A lot of girls of color have written some really powerful films and short films about men of color and their experiences around masculinity and sexuality and gender. And so there's some really, and gender identity. So Scenarios USA has some really powerful films that are really great for young people in these communities. So other folks have other stuff that they want to share? Looks like some of you are still with me, so if you have anything, I'd love for you to share it. And then some organizations that are doing specific work with marginalized communities. You know, Call to Men is really unique because it is a people of color-led organization. It's predominantly led by women of color in terms of the board of directors, and the founders are men of color. So I think a Call to Men is really unique in that way. They're having a national conference this year, and so definitely encourage you to check that out if you're interested or looking for to sort of expand, or if you haven't gotten training from a Call to Men, but a lot of the work is with communities of color. A lot of folks who are part of these marginalized communities, so definitely check that out. I wanted to share the Brown Boy Project, and for trans boys and men of color, and so there's not a lot of, unfortunately, there's not a lot of those sort of examples of organizations, like national organizations, that exist specifically around the sort of lived experience of trans men and masculine identified folks, and so the Brown Boy Project is fantastic, so definitely check that out. And then the third one is with Ajili. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's from my brothers at the Lakota Nation who are doing some work specifically with Native boys and men on reservations, and who have developed some really good practices, traditional practices, and programming with Native boys and men in North Dakota on the Sioux reservations. And so definitely check them out. You can find them on, so you can find all these organizations on social media, as well as definitely check out their website and all the resources that they've developed. So some really good example. So if folks have other organizations that they'd like to share, I'd love to hear from those. If you have any that you want to share, that would be super awesome. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's so many more organizations that's doing really great work out there. Please share that with folks on today's webinar, especially if you are doing some very culturally specific work with a particular community. Please share your contact information with us. Yeah, so any additional resources that you might have that you want to share, definitely feel free to do that. And then before we go, sort of in closing, we have about a minute before we end today's webinar, and I want to thank all of you so much for joining me and for listening to my voice for an hour and a half, and for engaging in some dialogue inside the chat room and sharing your insights and your experiences. But I'm sort of curious, sort of in closing, if you want to share with me what are your next steps, if any, that you're going to take to mobilize marginalized men. So what is sort of like something you're going to take from today's webinar and apply to your own personal work or to your organization's work with a particular community, or something that you haven't thought a lot about that you plan on thinking about. So if you want to share that, before you go, and as you head out, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation. Please do that. Be honest and share your thoughts and your feedback with us here at TAASA. And I want to thank Maya and Dukes and Denise for being with me this afternoon, this morning. I want to thank all of you so much for joining me this morning. I want to encourage you to contact me if I can be of any support or assistance. And please feel free to. And I wish you luck in all the work that you're doing, and I look forward to continuing to follow your work. And so if there's anything you want to share in the chat box, that'd be awesome before you say goodbye. So again, thank you all for being with me this morning.